A slice of paradise so perfect it could make a grown man weep. That's what I inherited 3 years ago when my grandfather's lake cabin on Crystal Lake became mine. This wasn't some gaudy Airbnb monstrosity with Wi-Fi and a wine fridge. No, this was a weathered cedar-sided beauty, a 2-bedroom relic from the 1970s with a stone fireplace that had cradled decades of family laughter and a rickety dock stretching into water so clear you could see fish plotting their escape from my hook. It was rustic, unpretentious, and paid off before I was born. Most importantly, it came with untouchable lakefront access, a golden ticket no amount of money could buy in today's world of overpriced waterfront lots. Or so I thought. The trouble crept in like a bad neighbor's yappy dog about 18 months ago. Sunset Shores, a shiny new HOA community, decided Crystal Lake wasn't complete without their cookie-cutter McMansions clogging up the shoreline. These weren't homes. They were architectural tantrums. 3-story behemoths with fake stone facades and lawns so manicured they looked like they'd been mowed with nail clippers. The county, dazzled by dollar signs, let them bulldoze the wildflower meadow next to my cabin to make way for their suburban utopia. I wasn't thrilled about trading my quiet mornings for the sound of leaf blowers and Karen's Pilates playlist blasting at 7 a.m., but I figured I'd grit my teeth and deal. Live and let live, right? Then I met the Karen Whitmore, to be precise, because the universe apparently decided my life needed a villain straight out of a Reddit thread. Karen wasn't just a resident of Sunset Shores. She was the self-crowned empress of its Neighborhood Improvement Committee, a title I'm pretty sure she invented while staring into a mirror and practicing her condescending smile. Picture a woman in her late 40s, blonde hair shellacked into a helmet defying both wind and logic, decked out in Lululemon like she was one yoga class away from Nirvana. She carried a clipboard like it was Excalibur and wielded her measuring tape with the precision of a sniper. Our first encounter was a masterclass in audacity. I just finished my coffee, barefoot on my porch, when I spotted her on my dock, uninvited, naturally, snapping photos of my cabin like she was auditioning for CSI HOA Edition. The sheer gall of this woman trespassing on my property without so much as a hello was almost performance art. I strolled down, forcing a smile that felt like chewing tinfoil, and called out, "Morning. Can I help you with something? Or is my dock just that photogenic?" Karen spun around, not a flicker of shame on her face. Her eyes scanned me like I was a stray dog who'd wandered into her gated community. "Oh, you must be the cabin owner," she said, her voice syrupy enough to give you diabetes. "I'm Karen Whitmore, chairwoman of the Sunset Shores Neighborhood Improvement Committee. I'm documenting some issues with your property." "Issues? With my property?" The cabin that had stood here since Nixon was president, minding its own business while her neighborhood was still a twinkle in some developer's greedy eye. I felt my left eyebrow twitch, a sure sign I was about to say something I'd regret. "What kind of issues?" I asked, crossing my arms and leaning against a dock post like I had all day to entertain her nonsense. Karen consulted her clipboard, which I'm convinced was her source of mystical power. "Well, for starters, your dock extends into the lake without proper permits. The aesthetic of your cabin is, let's say, inconsistent with our community standards. And the overall upkeep." She paused, pursing her lips like she'd just smelled expired milk. "Substandard, frankly. Substandard. My grandfather built half this cabin with his bare hands, and this woman, who probably couldn't hammer a nail without calling a contractor, had the nerve to call it substandard." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that strangling her with her own measuring tape was frowned upon by local law enforcement. "That's fascinating," I said, my voice dripping with the kind of politeness that could cut glass. "Considering my property predates your entire neighborhood by 50 years, which permits do you think I need for a dock that's older than your Botox?" Her smile flickered, just for a second, like a bad Wi-Fi signal. "Current regulations require," she started, but I wasn't in the mood for her HOA scripture. "Current regulations don't apply retroactively to grandfathered properties." I cut in, matching her smile with one so fake it could have starred in a toothpaste ad. "But thanks for the concern. Now, if you'll excuse me, you're trespassing?" So maybe take your clipboard and your community standards back to your side of the property line. A normal person would have mumbled an apology and slunk away. But Karen wasn't normal. She was an HOA Karen, a creature fueled by entitlement and the delusion that her rules applied to everyone within a 10-mile radius. She straightened her spine, gave me a look that could curdle milk, and said, "This isn't over." Then she marched off, her heels clicking on my dock like tiny declarations of war. I should have known then that I'd just poked a hornet's nest with a stick. Karen wasn't just annoyed. She was offended that someone dared question her authority. And if there's one thing an HOA Karen hates more than an unapproved mailbox, it's being told she's wrong. As I watched her disappear into the maze of McMansions, I had no idea I'd just signed up for a year-long battle with a woman who made Napoleon look like a quitter. But for now, I went back to my coffee, blissfully unaware that Karen was already plotting her next move. The lake sparkled, the birds sang, and my cabin stood defiant against the encroaching tide of HOA tyranny. Paradise was still mine, for the moment. If I thought Karen Whitmore would take my polite but pointed dismissal as a hint to back off, I was dumber than a box of hammers. Karen wasn't just an HOA busybody. She was a one-woman crusade, armed with the kind of persistence that could make a telemarketer look like a quitter. Her response to being told her rules didn't apply to my grandfather's lake cabin was to double down, like she was auditioning for the role of suburban supervillain. Spoiler alert, she nailed the part. It started subtly, like a mosquito you don't notice until it's already bitten you. A few days after our dockside showdown, I caught Karen lurking near my property line, her trusty clipboard clutched like a holy relic. She was measuring the distance between my mailbox and the road with a precision that suggested she was either planning to invade or applying for a job at NASA. I waved from my porch, hoping my cheerfulness would annoy her more than her presence annoyed me. She didn't wave back. Instead, she scribbled furiously, probably noting that my mailbox was 0.3 inches too close to the curb, a capital offense in her imaginary kingdom. Over the next few weeks, Karen's campaign of petty harassment kicked into high gear. She'd show up at all hours, uninvited, like a vampire who'd swapped bloodlust for bureaucracy. One morning, I found her photographing my trash cans on pickup day, muttering about how they were unsightly because, gasp, I hadn't hidden them behind a tasteful hedge. Another time, she measured the height of my grass with a ruler, declaring it non-compliant, with standards I wasn't subject to. The woman had the audacity to count the cars in my driveway when I had friends over for a barbecue, as if my social life was a personal affront to her HOA utopia. 3 vehicles, she'd hissed, scribbling like her life depended on it. That's excessive for a property of this size. Karen, I called out, flipping a burger on the grill. Unless you're planning to join us for hot dogs, maybe take your senses somewhere else. Her glare could have melted steel, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stomped back to her white BMW, which I was starting to think doubled as her mobile command center. I half expected to see a war room inside, complete with a map of my property marked with red pins and a whiteboard labeled Operation Ruin Cabin Guy's Life. The first official salvo arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered via certified mail because Karen clearly wanted to flex her bureaucratic muscles. The envelope was thick, embossed with the Sunset Shores HOA logo, a pretentious crest that looked like it was designed by someone who'd watched too many episodes of Downton Abbey. Inside was a letter so dripping with passive-aggressive venom it could have poisoned a small village. Dear property owner, it began because apparently using my name, Jake Harper, was too much effort for Karen's delicate sensibilities. The Sunset Shores Neighborhood Improvement Committee has identified multiple violations on your property that require immediate action to align with our community standards. The list that followed was a masterpiece of delusional nitpicking. My dock was visually intrusive, as if the lake itself cared about her aesthetic preferences. My cabin's cedar siding, weathered to a perfect silvery patina, was unprofessional in appearance. My outdoor furniture, 2 Adirondack chairs I'd built myself, was inconsistent with community guidelines. And my wind chimes, a gift from my late grandmother, were accused of creating noise pollution. Noise pollution, from chimes that tinkled softer than Karen's fake laugh. The kicker? The letter demanded I bring my property into full compliance within 30 days or face all available legal remedies. Legal remedies. For a cabin that wasn't even part of their HOA, built decades before their McMansions were a gleam in a developer's eye. The sheer chutzpah was almost admirable, like watching a toddler demand to drive the family car. I poured myself a second coffee and sat on my porch, rereading the letter while the lake sparkled in the morning sun. Part of me wanted to frame it as a monument to human absurdity, but the smarter part knew this was no joke. Karen wasn't just annoying. She was a problem that wasn't going away without a fight. So, I did what any self-respecting lake cabin owner would do. I started digging. I spent the next few evenings with my laptop, a six-pack, and a mission. I pulled up my property records, which confirmed what I already knew. My cabin was grandfathered in, free from HOA jurisdiction, with lakefront access secured by a 1970 easement that was ironclad. I scoured the Sunset Shores HOA covenants, publicly available, because apparently Karen didn't realize the internet existed, and found zero mention of their authority over non-member properties. I even called my buddy Tom, a real estate lawyer, who laughed so hard he nearly choked when I read him Karen's letter. "Jake, this woman's got nothing," he said between wheezes. "Her HOA has as much power over your cabin as I do over the moon. Send her a polite go pound sand letter, and she'll back off." So I did. I drafted a response on my letterhead. Okay, it was just my name in Times New Roman, but it felt official. "Dear Ms. Whitmore," I wrote, because unlike her, I knew how to use a name. "Thank you for your letter. After reviewing your concerns, I've confirmed that my property is not subject to Sunset Shores HOA covenants, as it predates your development by 50 years. Please refrain from further correspondence or trespassing on my property." I mailed it, certified, because two could play the bureaucracy game. I figured that would be the end of it. A reasonable person would read my letter, check their own rules, and realize they'd overstepped. But Karen wasn't reasonable. She was an HOA Karen, which meant she saw my letter not as a reality check, but as a declaration of war. The next morning, I woke to find a new citation taped to my mailbox, claiming my front yard was in violation of landscaping standards. The citation wasn't even on official letterhead, just a piece of printer paper with Karen's handwriting, which looked like it belonged on a ransom note. I laughed, then tucked it into my growing Karen file, a folder I'd started to document her nonsense. Something told me I'd need it. As I sipped my coffee, watching a loon glide across the lake, I felt the first stirrings of real anger. Karen wasn't just annoying. She was trying to bully me into submission, and I wasn't about to let some clipboard-wielding tyrant ruin my grandfather's legacy. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to become her worst nightmare. A property owner with a law degree's worth of Google-fueled research and a creative streak that could outsmart her entire HOA board. The lake was still peaceful, but the air felt heavier now, like the calm before a storm. Karen had fired her first shot, and I was loading my metaphorical cannons. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about principle. And if Karen thought she could intimidate me with her fake citations and certified letters, she was about to learn a very expensive lesson. You'd think a polite, legally backed go-away letter would make someone like Karen Whitmore pause, maybe even reconsider her life choices. But no, Karen wasn't wired for self-reflection. She was an HOA Karen, a species that thrives on conflict like a cockroach thrives on nuclear fallout. My letter didn't deter her. It lit a fuse. And let me tell you, that fuse led to a powder keg of pettiness so explosive it could have starred in a Michael Bay movie. The escalation was immediate and relentless. Karen's uninvited visits to my lake cabin went from occasional to a near-daily ritual. She'd roll up in her gleaming white BMW, clipboard in one hand, measuring tape in the other, like a suburban Sherlock Holmes investigating the crime of my existence. One afternoon, I caught her peering through my kitchen window while I was making a sandwich. I mean, really, Karen? Was my choice of mustard a violation of your sacred community standards? I rapped on the glass, startling her so badly she dropped her pen, which I'm pretty sure she later claimed as a casualty of war. Enjoying the view? I called through the window, slathering mayo on my bread with exaggerated flair. Should I pose for your next HOA newsletter? Her face turned the color of her yoga pants, hot pink, and she scurried off, muttering something about boundary violations. The irony was so thick I could have spread it on my sandwich. But Karen wasn't just snooping, she was documenting. Photos of my dock at sunrise, close-ups of my non-compliant cedar siding, even a snapshot of my kayak leaning against the cabin, labeled unauthorized equipment storage, in her increasingly unhinged notes. I found one of her citations stuck to my dock post, accusing my wind chimes of excessive auditory disturbance. I swear, if the lake's loons could file complaints, they'd have sued her for disturbing their peace with her constant clacking heels. But Karen's piece de resistance came on a crisp Saturday morning in late spring. I'd planned a perfect day, kayak out to the middle of Crystal Lake, catch a few fish, maybe nap on the dock with a beer. Simple pleasures, the kind my grandfather built this cabin for. Instead, I woke to a sight so absurd it felt like I'd stumbled into a Kafka novel. Karen's BMW was parked directly across my driveway entrance, not nudged to the side, not slightly askew, but perfectly centered, like she'd used a laser level to ensure maximum obstruction. It was a vehicular middle finger, a blockade so blatant it deserved its own UN resolution. I stood there in my flannel pajamas, coffee mug in hand, staring at this automotive atrocity. The audacity was almost poetic. I half expected Karen to leap out with a megaphone, declaring, "Surrender your cabin, peasant." Instead, she was down by the lake, clipboard in hand, measuring the depth of the water around my dock like she was planning to build a submarine base. I trudged over, the gravel biting my bare feet, my patience thinner than the ice on the lake last winter. "Karen," I said, keeping my voice as calm as a yoga instructor on Valium, "your car's blocking my driveway. Care to explain?" She turned, her smile so artificial it could have been 3D printed. "Oh, Jake, good morning," she chirped, like we were old pals catching up at a farmer's market. "I'm conducting an official property assessment. The car's placement is necessary for accuracy. I'll be done in a few hours." A few hours. This woman had trapped me on my own property and was acting like she was doing me a favor by scheduling my imprisonment. I felt my coffee mug grow warm from the sheer heat of my suppressed rage. "You need to move your car," I said, each word clipped like I was cutting it out with scissors. "Now." Karen's smile didn't budge. She consulted her clipboard, as if it held the secret to world domination. "I'm afraid that's not possible. This is official HOA business, and I have every right to ensure compliance with community standards. Community standards that don't apply to me." I snapped, my saintly patience evaporating. "You've got no authority here, Karen. Move your car, or I'm calling the cops." And that's when Karen made her fatal mistake. Instead of backing down, instead of realizing she'd pushed too far, her smile widened, and she said, "Oh, Jake, I already did." I blinked. "You what?" "I've called the sheriff's department," she said, her voice dripping with triumph. "I've reported multiple violations on your property, and I'm ensuring they're documented properly. They'll be here soon to address your noncompliance." For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. This woman had not only blockaded my driveway, but had preemptively called the police to back up her delusional power trip. It was like watching a toddler throw a tantrum, except the toddler had a law degree from the University of Entitlement and a BMW. I set my coffee mug on a dock post, crossed my arms, and leaned back, letting the absurdity wash over me like a wave. "Karen," I said, my voice low and dangerous, "you have no idea what you've just done." She smirked, mistaking my warning for surrender. "I suggest you cooperate with the officers, Jake. This doesn't have to get ugly." Oh, it was already ugly. Uglier than her taste in athleisure wear. But I didn't argue. I went back to my cabin, grabbed my Karen file, now thick enough to double as a doorstop, and waited for the cops to arrive. If Karen thought she could intimidate me with a couple of badges, she was about to learn that her imaginary authority didn't hold up in the real world. As I sat on my porch, watching the lake reflect the morning sun, I felt a strange calm. Karen had escalated this fight to a new level, but she'd also given me an opening. Her overreach was so blatant, so documented, that it was practically gift-wrapped for a lawsuit. I sipped my coffee, now cold, and smiled for the first time that morning. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a war, and I was about to bring a legal bazooka to her clipboard fight. The sound of gravel crunching under tires announced the sheriff's arrival. I stood, dusted off my pajamas, and prepared to meet Karen's so-called backup. The lake was still, the air was crisp, and Karen was about to get a reality check that would make her HOA dreams crumble like a stale cookie. Game on. The sheriff's cruiser rolled up my driveway like a reluctant guest to a party nobody wanted to attend. 2 deputies stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel, looking like they'd rather be fishing on Crystal Lake than dealing with whatever suburban soap opera Karen had dragged them into. Officer Martinez, a stocky guy with a mustache that screamed, "I've seen it all," carried a notepad and an expression of resigned patience. His partner, Officer Chun, younger and with a smirk that suggested he found this whole situation mildly entertaining, was already eyeing Karen's BMW, still parked like a smug barricade across my driveway. I stood there in my shorts and a faded t-shirt, my Karen file tucked under one arm, sipping the dregs of my now icy coffee. Karen, meanwhile, was in full pageant mode by the lake, having swapped her athleisure for a navy blazer that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She clutched a manila folder so thick it could have doubled as a blunt weapon, her posture radiating the confidence of someone who thought she'd already won. Spoiler, she hadn't. "Officers," Karen called, striding over with the enthusiasm of a talk show host greeting her audience. "Thank you for responding so promptly. I'm Karen Whitmore, chairwoman of the Sunset Shores Neighborhood Improvement Committee. This property has been in violation of multiple county ordinances for months, and the owner has been utterly uncooperative." Officer Martinez raised an eyebrow, his pen hovering over his notepad like he was debating whether this was worth the ink. "Ma'am, can you explain why your vehicle is blocking this gentleman's driveway?" Karen didn't miss a beat, her smile so polished it could have reflected sunlight. "I'm conducting an official property assessment," she said, as if that explained everything. "The positioning of my vehicle is necessary to ensure accurate documentation of the violations. It's temporary, of course." Officer Chun, who'd been measuring the distance between Karen's BMW and my property line with a tape measure he'd pulled from his belt, let out a low chuckle. "Ma'am, your car's parked entirely on private property. This driveway belongs to the cabin owner, and you're blocking his only access to the road. That's not exactly temporary. It's illegal." Karen's smile flickered, a crack in her armor, so brief you'd miss it if you blinked. "But surely there are provisions for official HOA business," she said, clutching her folder tighter, like it was her last line of defense. "This property is a blight on our community standards, and I'm ensuring compliance." Officer Martinez sighed, the kind of sigh you give when you've dealt with one too many HOA Karens in your career. "Ma'am, do you have any legal authority to conduct assessments on this property?" And that's when Karen made her second colossal mistake. Instead of admitting she was out of her depth, she puffed up like a peacock in a power suit and doubled down. "As chairwoman, I have the responsibility to ensure all properties in our area meet Sunset Shore standards," she declared, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd watched too many courtroom dramas. "This cabin has been a constant source of complaints from our residents. Unsightly structures, noise pollution, you name it." "I couldn't help it," I snorted loudly. Officer Chen glanced at me, his smirk widening, and I took that as my cue. "Officers, my name's Jake Harper," I said, stepping forward. "This cabin's been in my family since 1970, long before Sunset Shores existed. It's not part of their HOA, never has been, and I've got the paperwork to prove it." I opened my file, pulling out my deed and a property survey that showed my lot's boundaries clearer than Karen's agenda. "Karen's been harassing me for months, trespassing, taking photos, leaving fake citations. And now she's blocked my driveway and called you to back up her nonsense." Officer Martinez took the documents, scanning them with the efficiency of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. You're saying this property isn't under HOA jurisdiction? Not even a little, I said, crossing my arms. My grandfather bought this land before their development was a twinkle in a realtor's eye. The HOA's covenants explicitly exclude non-member properties, and my lakefront access is protected by a 1970 easement. Karen's got no authority here, but she's been acting like she owns my cabin. Officer Chun handed back my survey, nodding. And you've got records of this harassment? I patted my file, now thick enough to rival Karen's. Every letter, every citation, every time she's trespassed. I've got photos, dates, even a video of her measuring my grass like it's a national security threat. Karen's face was starting to resemble a ripe tomato, but she wasn't ready to surrender. Officers, I have evidence, she insisted, thrusting her folder forward. Photos of unpermitted structures, aesthetic violations, noise complaints. Ma'am, Officer Martinez interrupted, his patience thinner than my cabin's Wi-Fi signal. Aesthetic violations aren't criminal matters. Unless you can show us specific county code violations, you're trespassing on private property and obstructing access. That's what we're here to address. The word trespassing hit Karen like a slap. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like a goldfish realizing the bowl's too small. But the community standards, she stammered, clutching her folder like it could save her from reality. Officer Chen wasn't having it. Ma'am, you need to move your vehicle. Now, or we'll cite you for trespassing and have it towed. Karen's facade finally cracked, her eyes darting between the officers and me like she was expecting a last-minute save from her HOA fairy godmother. None came. She muttered something incoherent, then stomped to her BMW, slamming the door so hard I thought the windows would shatter. The car screeched out of my driveway, leaving a cloud of dust and the faint scent of her overpriced perfume. As the deputies wrapped up, Martinez handed me a card. If she comes back, call us. And keep documenting everything. Sounds like she's not done yet. I nodded, tucking the card into my file. Oh, I'm ready for her. The deputies drove off, leaving me alone with the lake's gentle lapping and a growing sense of victory. Karen had called the cops to intimidate me, but instead, she'd handed me a trump card. Her stunt had been so blatantly illegal, so perfectly documented, that it was practically begging to be used against her. I went back to my porch, poured a fresh coffee, and opened my laptop. It was time to take this fight to the next level. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden ripples across Crystal Lake, I felt the tide turning. Karen thought she'd won by calling the cops, but she'd just given me the ammunition I needed to blow her HOA empire to smithereens. The war was far from over, but for the first time, I was starting to enjoy it. You'd think getting schooled by 2 sheriff's deputies would make Karen Whitmore rethink her life choices, maybe trade her clipboard for a hobby that didn't involve tormenting innocent cabin owners. But Karen wasn't built for introspection. She was an HOA Karen, a creature so fueled by righteous indignation that public humiliation only made her double down like a gambler chasing a bad bet. The deputy's visit didn't stop her. It just made her madder, and boy, did she lean into it with the enthusiasm of a reality TV villain. The next phase of Karen's war on my peaceful lake cabin existence kicked off with a letter that arrived a week after her driveway blockade fiasco. It wasn't just any letter. It was a cease and desist from an actual attorney, printed on letterhead so fancy it probably cost more than my monthly propane bill. The lawyer, some guy named Gerald P. Rutherford from a firm called Rutherford & Associates, because apparently mediocre HOA law R Us wasn't catchy enough, claimed to represent the Sunset Shores HOA and, by extension, their self-appointed dictator, Karen. The letter was a masterpiece of legal gibberish, accusing me of ongoing violations that threatened the integrity of the community. It demanded I stop all non-compliant activities, like what existing, bring my cabin into aesthetic alignment with their McMansion utopia, and, get this, pay a $2,500 fine for my continued defiance. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. A fine for a property they had no authority over. Gerald must have been billing by the word, because this was pure fiction. Karen, I muttered to my empty porch. You've upgraded from delusional to certifiable. The lake sparkled mockingly in the morning sun, as if it knew the absurdity I was dealing with. I tucked the letter into my ever-growing Karen file, now so thick it could double as a yoga block for her next Pilates class. But Karen wasn't content with just legal threats. Oh no, she went full supervillain, unleashing a campaign of bureaucratic harassment that would have made a DMV employee proud. Suddenly, my cabin was Grand Central Station for county inspectors, all responding to anonymous complaints that had Karen's fingerprints all over them. The building inspector showed up to check 4 unpermitted structures, eyeing my dock like it was hiding a meth lab. The environmental officer poked around my septic system, muttering about potential contamination that didn't exist. The code enforcement guy arrived to investigate health and safety violations, which turned out to be Karen's complaint about my wind chimes again. Even the fire marshal made an appearance, claiming someone reported improper fire safety equipment. Spoiler, my fire extinguisher was fully functional, unlike Karen's grip on reality. Each inspector wore the same weary expression, like they knew they were pawns in a neighbor dispute, but had to check the boxes anyway. Sorry, Mr. Harper, the building inspector said, scratching his head. We have to follow up on every complaint, no matter how creative. Creative's one word for it, I replied, handing him a copy of my property records. How about frivolous, or completely made up? He chuckled, signed off on my compliance, and left. Every inspector reached the same conclusion. My cabin was cleaner than Karen's conscience. But the constant visits were starting to wear me down. I couldn't fish, kayak, or even enjoy a beer on my dock without wondering which county employee would show up next, clipboard in hand, looking apologetic. Then Karen got really creative. My trash can started getting knocked over on pickup day, spilling coffee grounds and fish guts across my driveway. My mailbox was defaced with stickers screaming, property violation, in Comic Sans, because apparently Karen's aesthetic standards didn't extend to typography. One morning, I found my dock plastered with fake citations, each one accusing me of increasingly unhinged infractions, unauthorized water feature, the lake itself, apparently, excessive natural flora, my unmowed wildflowers, and my personal favorite, disruptive wildlife encouragement, because I tossed some bread to the ducks. But Karen's piece de resistance was her propaganda campaign. She started hosting concerned citizen meetings at the Sunset Shores Community Center, where she'd present slideshows of my cabin like it was the neighborhood's personal Chernobyl. She even created a Facebook group called Protecting Our Lake Community, a digital shrine to her obsession with my property. The posts were gold, blurry photos of my dock captioned, "This eyesore is tanking our property values," and rants about how my unkempt cabin was scaring off high-end buyers. One post even claimed my wind chimes were disturbing migratory birds. I mean, come on, Karen, the loons were laughing harder than I was. The group had maybe 30 members, mostly her fellow HOA zealots, but it was enough to make my blood boil. She wasn't just harassing me. She was trying to turn the whole neighborhood into her personal army. I pictured her standing at a podium, clipboard raised like a dictator's scepter, rallying her troops with cries of, "Down with the rustic cabin." It would have been hilarious if it wasn't my life. That's when I decided I was done playing defense. Karen wanted a war. Fine. I was ready to go full Sun Tzu on her entitled backside. But I wasn't going to stoop to her level with petty vandalism or social media rants. No, I was going to fight smart, with the one weapon Karen clearly didn't understand: the law. I called my buddy Tom, the real estate lawyer, who'd been following my saga with the enthusiasm of a kid watching a superhero movie. "Jake, this woman's handing you a lawsuit on a silver platter," he said, practically giddy. "She's trespassing, filing false reports, slandering you online. You've got enough evidence to bury her in her HOA. Any recommendations for a lawyer who eats HOAs for breakfast?" I asked. Tom didn't hesitate. "Sarah Mitchell. She's a shark in a blazer. Specializes in HOA disputes and loves taking down bullies like your Karen." I met Sarah the next day at a coffee shop in town, where she listened to my story with the focus of a sniper lining up a shot. She was in her 50s, sharp as a tack, with a laugh that sounded like she was already planning Karen's legal funeral. "So," she said, stirring her latte, "this woman's been harassing you for months, using HOA resources, with no authority whatsoever, and now she's got a lawyer sending you fake fines?" "That's the gist," I said, sliding my Karen file across the table. "She's even got the county running in circles with her complaints." Sarah flipped through the file, her grin widening with every page. "Oh, this is delicious. We're going to hit her with a harassment lawsuit so hard she'll wish she'd stuck to yoga. But first, let's try a little psychological warfare." Sarah drafted a letter that was a work of art, professional, precise, and sharper than a guillotine. It outlined Karen's laundry list of illegal antics: trespassing, stalking, filing false reports, and interfering with my right to quiet enjoyment of my property. It demanded a written apology and an immediate end to her harassment, or we'd file a lawsuit for damages, attorney fees, and a restraining order. The best part? It was addressed to Karen personally, not the HOA, making it clear she was on the hook for her own stupidity. I mailed it, certified, and waited. Karen's response was predictable. Another letter from Gerald, claiming my hiring a lawyer was evidence of guilt and threatening further legal action. I showed it to Sarah, who laughed so hard she nearly choked on her coffee. "This guy's either incompetent or desperate," she said. "Either way, Karen's about to learn what happens when you poke a bear with a stick." As Sarah prepped the lawsuit, I started my own side project. Karen's HOA was a house of cards, built on sloppy governance and unchecked egos. I dug into their bylaws, meeting minutes, and financial records, all public, because HOAs are basically mini-governments with all the accountability of a toddler with a crayon. What I found was a gold mine: unposted meetings, missing financial reports, and enforcement procedures that violated their own rules. And Karen's Neighborhood Improvement Committee, it didn't exist in their bylaws. She'd made it up, like a kid inventing a title to sound important at a school play. I sat on my dock that night, the lake reflecting a blood-red sunset, and grinned. Karen thought she was untouchable, but she'd just handed me the keys to her downfall. The war was heating up, and I was about to turn her HOA into a cautionary tale for entitled busybodies everywhere. By now, Karen Whitmore's war on my lake cabin had gone from annoying to a full-blown obsession, and I was done playing nice. Her driveway blockade, fake citations, and parade of county inspectors had turned my peaceful retreat into a bureaucratic circus, and her latest stunt, hiring a lawyer to send me a cease and desist letter for crimes, like owning wind chimes, was the final straw. Karen thought she was the queen of Sunset Shores, ruling with her clipboard like a scepter, but she was about to meet her match: a fed-up cabin owner with a law degree's worth of Google-fueled research, a shark of a lawyer, and a creative streak that could outsmart her entire HOA board. The gloves were off, and I was ready to fight dirty. Legally, of course. My first move was to lean into Sarah Mitchell's plan for psychological warfare. Sarah, my attorney, was a force of nature, a woman who could make an HOA board cry with a single raised eyebrow. After reviewing my Karen file, now thick enough to double as a dumbbell, she proposed a two-pronged attack: hit Karen personally with a harassment lawsuit and expose the Sunset Shores HOA's vulnerabilities to dismantle her power base. "This woman's operating on borrowed authority," Sarah said, her eyes gleaming over her coffee. "We're going to show her what real power looks like." While Sarah prepped the legal paperwork, I turned my attention to the HOA itself. Thanks to my late-night research sessions, fueled by coffee and righteous indignation, I'd uncovered a treasure trove of dirt on Sunset Shores. Their bylaws were a mess, their meeting notices were as legal as a monopoly board, and their financial records were sketchier than a used car salesman's handshake. Best of all, Karen's precious Neighborhood Improvement Committee was a complete fiction. No mention of it in the bylaws, no board approval, nothing. She'd been running her harassment campaign under a made-up title, using HOA letterhead like it was her personal stationery. It was like finding out the school bully was just a kid in a stolen hall monitor badge. I decided to take the fight to Karen's home turf, the Sunset Shores HOA board meeting. These meetings were public, a fact Karen clearly didn't expect me to know, and I had every right to show up as a concerned citizen. The thought of walking into her domain, armed with facts and a briefcase full of evidence, made me grin like a kid who'd just found the cookie jar. I spent the week preparing, printing copies of the HOA's bylaws, my property records, and a timeline of Karen's antics that read like a true crime novel. I even threw in a photo of her BMW blocking my driveway, because who doesn't love a visual aid? The meeting was held in the Sunset Shores Community Center, a soulless building that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. I arrived early, dressed in my best suit, a navy number I usually reserved for funerals and court dates, carrying a leather briefcase that screamed, "I mean business." The board members, 5 retirees who looked like they'd rather be playing bridge, were already seated at a folding table, shuffling papers nervously. Karen was in the back, holding court with her posse of HOA loyalists, her blonde hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights like a beacon of entitlement. As I took a front row seat, Karen's eyes locked onto me, and for a split second, her face betrayed pure panic. It was delicious, like watching a cat realize the mouse it's been chasing has a flamethrower. She recovered quickly, plastering on her trademark smile, but I could tell she was rattled. Good. She should be. The meeting started with the usual HOA drivel, approving last month's minutes, discussing pool maintenance, and debating whether the community's hedges were the correct shade of green. I sat quietly, biding my time, my briefcase resting on my knees like a ticking bomb. Karen, oblivious to the storm brewing, was scheduled to present her Neighborhood Improvement Committee report, which I knew would be another rant about my cabin's alleged sins. When her turn came, she strutted to the front like she was walking the runway at HOA Fashion Week, her manila folder bulging with what I assumed were more blurry photos of my dock. "Good evening," she began, clicking on a PowerPoint that looked like it was designed by someone who'd failed graphic design school. "The Neighborhood Improvement Committee has been diligently addressing properties that threaten our community's standards." What followed was a 15-minute tirade about my cabin, complete with slides labeled aesthetic violations and property value threats. She showed a photo of my dock, claiming it was structurally unsound. It wasn't. Called my cedar siding a blight on the neighborhood. It's called character, Karen, and even accused my wind chimes of disrupting migratory bird patterns. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. The board members nodded politely, clearly uncomfortable but too spineless to challenge her. A few residents chimed in with supportive questions, like, "What can we do about this eyesore? And can we fine him?" When Karen finished, the board president, Bob, a retired accountant who looked like he'd aged 10 years since the meeting started, cleared his throat. "Any questions or comments from the audience?" I stood, my suit jacket creaking slightly, and all eyes turned to me. Karen's smile froze, and I swear I heard her swallow. "I have a few questions," I said, my voice calm but carrying like a foghorn. "First, could Ms. Whitmore clarify what legal authority her Neighborhood Improvement Committee has to assess properties outside the HOA's jurisdiction, like mine?" The room went silent, like someone had hit the mute button on a bad sitcom. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting to her folder as if it could save her. "The committee operates under the board's authority to maintain community standards," she said, her voice a touch shakier than usual. "Interesting," I said, pulling the HOA bylaws from my briefcase. "Because I've read your bylaws, cover to cover, twice, and there's no mention of a Neighborhood Improvement Committee. No charter, no approval, nothing. Could you point me to the section that establishes your authority?" Bob's eyes widened, and the other board members shifted uncomfortably. Karen's face was now the color of her blazer, splotchy red. "It's an ad hoc committee," she stammered, which was HOA speak for "I made it up." I wasn't done. "Secondly," I continued, pulling out copies of her letters, "I have here correspondence sent on official HOA letterhead, claiming authority over my property, which isn't part of your HOA. Are you aware, Bob, that allowing Ms. Whitmore to use your organization's name for harassment could make the HOA liable for her actions?" Bob looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. We weren't fully aware of the details, he mumbled. So you authorized her to trespass, file false complaints, and block my driveway without oversight? I asked, holding up the photo of her BMW. A few residents gasped, and one guy in the back whispered, "That's her car." The room was now a pressure cooker, and I was turning up the heat. "One last thing," I said, pulling out a copy of the harassment lawsuit Sarah had filed that morning. "This is a lawsuit against Ms. Whitmore for her illegal actions. I'm giving the board a chance to distance yourselves from her before I amend it to include the HOA as a defendant." Chaos erupted. Residents were shouting, board members were whispering frantically, and Karen stood frozen, her folders slipping from her hands like her dreams of HOA domination. Bob called for an emergency session, and Karen was escorted out, her face a mask of shock and fury. As I sat back down, the lake's calm outside the community center felt a world away. Karen had thought she could bully me into submission, but she'd underestimated me. I wasn't just fighting for my cabin anymore. I was fighting for every property owner who'd ever been terrorized by an HOA Karen. And I was just getting started. The Sunset Shores HOA board meeting had gone from a sleepy suburban ritual to a full-blown circus, and I was the ringmaster. Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of clipboard tyranny, had just been handed her walking papers in front of her adoring fans, and the look on her face, part shock, part rage, part "I'm about to cry in my BMW," was worth every sleepless night I'd spent researching her HOA's dirty laundry. But I wasn't done. Oh no. Karen had turned my lake cabin life into a bureaucratic nightmare, and I was about to return the favor with a vengeance so legal, so precise, it could have been choreographed by a Swiss watchmaker. As the board scrambled into their emergency session, I leaned back in my front row seat, my briefcase now lighter, but my resolve heavier than ever. The community center buzzed with whispers from residents, some outraged, some confused, and a few, bless their rebellious hearts, trying to hide their grins. Karen's posse, a gaggle of yoga moms and retired busybodies, shot me glares that could have curdled milk, but I just smiled back, sipping from a water bottle like I was at a matinee instead of a showdown. The air was thick with tension, and I loved every second of it. Karen had thought she could bully me into submission, but she'd awakened a beast with a law degree's worth of Google and an attorney who ate HOAs for breakfast. While the board deliberated, I mentally reviewed my next steps. My attorney, Sarah Mitchell, had filed the harassment lawsuit against Karen that morning, a legal missile aimed straight at her personal assets. But my research into the Sunset Shores HOA had uncovered something even juicier. The organization was a house of cards, built on procedural violations, financial shenanigans, and a board so clueless they made the Three Stooges look like Rhodes Scholars. Karen's harassment campaign hadn't just been her personal vendetta. It had been enabled by an HOA that let her run wild with their letterhead and resources. That made them liable, and I was about to make them regret ever hearing the name Jake Harper. The board emerged after 30 minutes. Looking like they'd just survived a hostage negotiation. Bob, the president, was sweating through his polo shirt, his comb-over wilting under the fluorescent lights. He cleared his throat, holding a piece of paper that trembled slightly in his hands. After discussion, he began, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "The board has agreed to the following. Ms. Whitmore is removed from any position within the HOA, effective immediately. We will issue a written apology to Mr. Harper for any misunderstandings. And we assure Mr. Harper that no further actions will be taken against his property." The room erupted again, with Karen's supporters shouting protests and a few residents clapping. Whether for me or the drama, I wasn't sure. Karen, who'd been allowed back in but relegated to the back row, stood up, her face a storm cloud. "This is outrageous," she screeched, her voice hitting a pitch that could have shattered wine glasses. "I've been protecting this community, and you're throwing me under the bus for him." Bob raised a hand, looking like he'd rather be wrestling a bear. "Karen, please. The board's decision is final." She stormed out, her heels clacking like gunfire, leaving a wake of stunned silence. I caught the eye of a guy in a golf shirt who gave me a subtle thumbs up, and I nodded back. Allies were forming, and Karen's empire was crumbling faster than her fake smile. But that was just the opening act. The real fireworks came when I filed complaints with the state HOA regulatory agency, a move I'd been planning since I discovered Sunset Shore's laundry list of violations. I sent them everything: evidence of unposted meetings, missing financial disclosures, and enforcement actions that violated their own bylaws. I included a detailed account of Karen's harassment, complete with her fake citations, trespassing photos, and the fact that her neighborhood improvement committee was as legitimate as a $3 bill. For good measure, I threw in the sheriff's report from her driveway stunt, because nothing says credible complaint like a police record. The state didn't mess around. Within weeks, they launched a full investigation into Sunset Shores, and what they found was a bureaucratic dumpster fire. The HOA had been cutting corners for years, assuming no one would bother to check. They were fined $15,000 for procedural violations, forced to overhaul their governance structure, and placed under state supervision for 6 months. 3 board members, including Bob, resigned rather than face the scrutiny, leaving the HOA scrambling to rebuild with a skeleton crew of terrified volunteers. Karen's personal reckoning was even sweeter. Her lawyer, Gerald P. Rutherford, must have realized he'd hitched his wagon to a sinking ship, because he withdrew from her case faster than you can say billable hours. Left to fend for herself, Karen faced my harassment lawsuit alone, with no legal leg to stand on. Sarah had built an airtight case, backed by my meticulously documented Karen file and witness statements from neighbors who'd grown tired of her reign of terror. One guy, a retiree named Frank who'd been at the board meeting, even offered to testify about Karen's concerned citizen rants, calling her a one-woman HOA Gestapo. The lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was about justice. Sarah demanded $25,000 in damages, attorney fees, and a restraining order to keep Karen 500 feet from my property, basically the length of her entire McMansion's front lawn. The cherry on top? We required a written confession, admitting she had no authority over my cabin and that her harassment was unjustified. I pictured Karen signing it, her manicured nails digging into the pen, and it warmed my heart like a campfire on a chilly lake night. Karen tried to fight back, sending me one last letter, handwritten, because apparently Gerald had cut off her access to fancy letterhead. It was a rambling mess, accusing me of destroying the community spirit and undermining property values. She even had the gall to claim I'd provoked her by not complying with her imaginary rules. I framed it, right next to my grandfather's old fishing rod, as a monument to her spectacular cell phone. As the legal wheels turned, I kept the pressure on the HOA. I started attending every board meeting, not to gloat, okay, maybe a little, but to ensure they followed through on their promises. The new board, a mix of chastened holdovers and nervous newbies, treated me like I was the IRS auditor of their nightmares. They implemented a policy banning interference with non-HOA properties and even put up a sign at the community entrance, HOA authority limited to member properties only. I suggested they add, "Thanks, Karen," in fine print, but they didn't go for it. The lake was quieter now, the inspectors gone, the fake citations a distant memory. But the fight wasn't over, not until Karen faced the full consequences of her actions. As I sat on my dock, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a surge of anticipation. Karen's downfall was imminent, and I was about to savor the sweetest victory of all, watching her HOA dreams burn to the ground, with a court-ordered check in my pocket to boot. The dust from the Sunset Shores HOA board meeting settled like ash after a volcano, and Karen Whitmore's reign of clipboard terror was officially over. The woman who'd turned my lake cabin life into a bureaucratic horror show was now a pariah, stripped of her imaginary title and facing a lawsuit that would make her wish she'd stuck to harassing her yoga instructor. But the fallout from that meeting? Oh, it was sweeter than a summer sunset over Crystal Lake, and I was savoring every moment like a cold beer on my dock. Within a week of the board's emergency session, Karen was officially persona non grata in Sunset Shores. The new board, a ragtag crew of shell-shocked retirees and reluctant volunteers, issued a formal apology letter, printed on the same pretentious HOA letterhead Karen had once weaponized. "Dear Mr. Harper," it began, "we sincerely regret any distress caused by unauthorized actions taken in our name. The Sunset Shores HOA disavows Ms. Whitmore's activities and assures you no further interference will occur." It was signed by the new president, a nervous woman named Linda who looked like she'd rather be knitting than dealing with Karen's mess. I framed the letter and hung it in my cabin's living room, right next to a photo of my grandfather fishing, because nothing says victory like rubbing it in with interior decor. But Karen's personal reckoning was the real showstopper. My attorney, Sarah Mitchell, had crafted a harassment lawsuit so airtight it could have survived a nuclear blast. With my Karen file as ammunition, photos, citations, sheriff's reports, and even a neighbor's affidavit calling Karen a menace with a measuring tape, the case was a slam dunk. Karen's lawyer, Gerald P. Rutherford, had bailed faster than a rat off a sinking ship, leaving her to face the music alone. Sarah pushed for $25,000 in damages, attorney fees, a restraining order keeping Karen 500 feet from my property, and the piece de resistance, a written confession admitting she had no authority over my cabin and her harassment was baseless. I imagined Karen signing it, her perfectly manicured nails trembling, and it felt like Christmas morning. The settlement came faster than I expected. Karen, realizing she was out of moves, agreed to everything out of court. The $25,000 check arrived in my mailbox, along with the confession, a single page of text so begrudging it practically dripped with her tears. I, Karen Whitmore, acknowledged that I had no legal authority to enforce HOA regulations on Jake Harper's property, it read, and my actions were unwarranted. I read it aloud to my buddy Tom over beers on the dock, and we laughed until we couldn't breathe. The restraining order was the cherry on top, ensuring Karen couldn't so much as drive past my cabin without risking a night in county lockup. But the best part? Karen's social collapse. 3 months after the settlement, she packed up her BMW and fled Sunset Shores, unable to face the neighbors who now saw her as the HOA's cautionary tale. Word spread fast. Her Protecting Our Lake Community Facebook group imploded when residents realized she'd been lying about her authority. Posts calling my cabin an eyesore were replaced with memes about Karen's driveway stunt. One captioned, "When your HOA Karen gets towed by reality." I heard through the grapevine she'd moved to a condo in another state, probably to terrorize some new, unsuspecting neighborhood. Good riddance, Karen. Don't let the lake hit you on the way out. The HOA itself was in shambles. The state's investigation, triggered by my complaints, uncovered a bureaucratic dumpster fire, unposted meetings, missing financial records, and enforcement actions that violated state law. The $15,000 fine was just the start. Sunset Shores was forced to rewrite their bylaws, hire an external auditor, and endure 6 months of state oversight. Half the board resigned, including Bob, who I'm pretty sure retired to a bunker to avoid ever hearing the word HOA again. The new board, desperate to avoid another Jake Harper, implemented a policy banning any interference with non-HOA properties. They even installed a sign at the community entrance, HOA authority limited to member properties only. I suggested adding, in memory of Karen's ego, but Linda politely declined. My cabin life returned to its blissful normalcy. Mornings were spent on my dock, coffee in hand, watching the sun paint the lake gold. The inspectors stopped coming, the fake citations vanished, and my wind chimes tinkled without fear of prosecution. I added a sign by my driveway, historic property, EST 1970, not subject to HOA nonsense. It was petty, sure, but every time a Sunset Shores resident walked by and nodded respectfully, it felt like a tiny victory lap. The saga had an unexpected side effect. I became a local legend. Property owners across the county started calling me for advice on dealing with their own HOA Karens. "How do you get that crazy lady to back off?" they'd ask, and I'd share my playbook. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to lawyer up. I helped a guy in the next town stop his HOA from fining him for a non-compliant mailbox, and a woman on the other side of the lake fended off a Karen wannabe over her garden gnomes. Each win felt like a middle finger to Karen's legacy. The funniest twist? The new HOA board sent me a letter asking if I'd serve as a consultant on property rights issues. Your expertise could help us avoid future conflicts, Linda wrote, probably sweating as she typed. I declined, politely, because I'm not Karen, but suggested they frame a copy of my lawsuit as a reminder of what happens when an HOA gets too big for its britches. They didn't take me up on it, but I like to think they considered it. As for my cabin, it's never looked better. The cedar siding glows in the sunlight, the dock holds strong, and my property value? Skyrocketing, thanks to the story of the guy who took down an HOA tyrant. Buyers love a property with a history of sticking it to the man. I spend my days fishing, kayaking, and enjoying the peace my grandfather built this place for, free from Karen's clipboard and her imaginary empire. Karen taught me a valuable lesson. Entitled people only have the power you give them. Arm yourself with knowledge, a good lawyer, and a knack for creative revenge, and you can make any HOA Karen regret crossing you. As I sit on my dock, watching the loons glide across Crystal Lake, I raise my coffee mug to her spectacular defeat. Here's to property rights, legal victories, and the sweet, sweet silence of a Karen-free life. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.